we have been giving you guys some awesome tips to help you build your business as a realtor. So you guys, we're going to close out, you guys, 2024 with the topic, guys, that we all need to hear about. So my name is Wabette Johansson. I'm actually your brand new Realtors CAREB Education Coordinator. And we have on with me my partner in crime, Mr. Mike, who is actually on my committee. And not only does he see my partner in crime, but he's also my guest speaker of today. So today, you guys, Mike, who has over 2 decades in the real estate industry. He is, you guys, an expert in affordable housing, property management, redevelopment, financing, everything. You guys, anything real estate, you guys, that's Mr. Mike. And today, you guys, we want to talk about some of the changes to the contracts that will take place in 2025. So you guys, please, you guys, welcome our guest speaker for today, Mr. Mike Shankman.
Shankman.
Guys are 25.
We'll get it.
Take it away, Mike.
Hey, real quick, am I coming through clear? I'm not getting choppy or anything,
yes,
right?
You're
okay. You were breaking up a little bit, so I didn't.
Oh, I was okay. Sorry. No, you are perfect.
Oh, well, not perfect, but thank you. I appreciate that. But welcome and thank you. And it's a pleasure to be on this with you guys and to be here with CAREB and be a part of CAREB. You know, my background is really in a lot of contract. I've done compliance. I've done a lot of different functions over the years. And especially now, we've had a lot that's happened over, I'd say, the last 6 months. We've had a couple things happen here and there. I think we can all agree. There's been a couple small changes. So what I'm going to go over, I know we only have an hour, so I'm going to make sure to jump into this as quick as we can and go over all the form revisions. And remember, with the California Association of Realtors, they do 2 form updates per year. The mid-year update, which is around June, July, and then, of course, our December end-of-year update for the new year of in this case, 2025. A lot of the stuff we're seeing, because we've had the biggest change we've seen in generations with the buyer representation changes. And so what happens, which we all knew, is we were going to have this change come into play and then see where the issues were and start doing changes to the changes. So that's where we're at right now. And there's a couple very key fundamental ones. I'll at the end show you where you can see all of them. I'm going to go over some very important ones and then give you guys some background on a few of them. So in total, we have 64 total forms that have been changed for this update. Of that 64 total forms, we have 7 brand new forms, which I'll get into. And then from there, we have 21 substantial revisions, which I'll be going over, 28 simple form revisions, and 8 property management revisions. Now, of the form revisions, I'll explain that in a minute, what the difference is between the 21, the 28, and of course, with the property management. So we'll start with the 7 new forms. These are brand new, and a lot of these are based on the changes of the settlement. And then I'm going to get into AB 2022, all that stuff. Cancellation of agency confirmation, that's new. The transfer of buyer representation is new. We have 2 estimated compensation cost forms, one for seller and buyer. There's been a change for the increased deposit addendum. And then, of course, the rental property owner and offer of tenant positive rental payments. You'll see these are transactional, the ones in yellow, and then the ones in green are property management. Now, I'm not going to be going over the property management forms today. They're pretty self-explanatory when you look at them. If anyone has questions, I'll have my contact info at the end. You're welcome to reach out. But just for purposes of time today, I'm going to go over some of the main points, and that means probably avoiding some of the property management. So with the substantial revisions, these are all the forms that had what's called substantial revisions, something that we should be going over and understanding. I'm not going over all of them. I'm going over a majority of them. And then I'll show you some things that all had a major update to it in terms of entity signatures. Aside from that, we had 28 general form revisions. And what does that mean? It means we don't have to go over them. You can see them yourselves. A lot of times what CARA has done now is they have every 4 years with standard forms, they will review them and see if they need any updates. Sometimes it's just typos or reorganization of some information, so it's a little more clear language, but nothing that was really in something that we have to like focus on too much. A lot of things had to conform to changes in the listing agreement, purchase agreement, etc. But there were, as I mentioned, some changes to entity signatures, which I'll show you here in just a second. A lot of the changes were based on this, changes to realtor commission for home buyers and sellers. And of course, that was a major focus of everything we had to deal with from, even March on, we've been dealing with this sort of change and how this is going to work with our industry. And I know for many of you, think back now how long the last 6 months have been. or not even that, 4 months, and how some of these changes were when we were thinking about it in July, and how we've adapted to our environment now going through the last few months. I know personally I've seen it become a little easier because the transparency has worked in my benefit. So as long as we're explaining these things, but I want you to think of some of the issues you may have had and then look at these changes that you're seeing for these new forms. So we'll start with the residential purchase agreement. That has been the one that's had the most substantial changes we've seen in regards to compensation. Now, the first change was for simplicity. The extra space, and all these forms can be found on CAR. They go live next week. If you were to go on Zip Forms right now, there's a little red link at the top, and I can send you the link also, which will show you all the red line versions of these that I'm going over today, which show the changes. On page 1, I don't know how many of you have used an increased deposit anytime recently. It's been a while since I've done it. And someone might be asking, well, what is an increased deposit? Well, obviously, when we do our offer, we do an earnest money deposit to secure down the property, as well as liquidated damage for the buyer or for the seller later on, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I know there are times in the past I used what's called an increased deposit, which is maybe, at removal of contingency, we decided to put another 1% or a few $1,000s in, something like that to help us with the negotiation and the offer. I know I used it when I had people who were working in the service industry and they only got so much money every few weeks. So that was the last time I remember using it. In any event, it was found that it was rarely used. And with everything needed in the RPA, we don't have to have this. So what happened was it was converted into an addendum. Oh, whoops. I thought I included the addendum. I'm sorry. Oh yeah, right here for the increased deposit addendum. And you'll see attached increased deposit addendum, which is the CAR form IDA. And everything that was in the language for the increased deposit has been shifted into that. If you want to use that, you would simply check the box. It'll auto-populate in Zip Forms, and then it comes up. So that is a new form, but it's a revision of kind of how the old system was. It was meant to free up some of that space. So now, some of the more substantial changes have to do, of course, with changes to buyer compensation and how we do it. Now, think of the logic of this first and foremost before we get into this. What has been some of the biggest questions that have come up? What is compensation versus what's a seller concession versus a buyer compensation? And we've been seeing all these things get grouped together, and that's where a lot of the arguments have started to come of, well, what's here, what's there, what counts in this percentage? So now the language has been starting to clarify this, and you can see that there is a clear distinction we're trying to make between what is a buyer expense and cost, what is a compensation, what is a concession. So a concession would be like, my seller is going to pay your buyer's closing costs or cover, say, termite repair or some sort of thing. Sorry, my daughter's cat likes to jump in. If I'm speaking, my daughter's cat jumps in, which is my cat. That's how it is. That's Harley. Now, this is where we're seeing that distinction. First and foremost, new title. Remember, this used to just be expenses. This is now seller payment to cover buyer expenses and costs, okay? And you're seeing it's been broken into several sections. So G1, only for closing costs, period. What is not a closing cost? Your compensation as an agent. We're separating that out. Okay, a concession could be a closing cost. So that's what we're starting to look at here. And you'll notice as we move down, additional seller credit terms does not include buyer broker compensation. So when we're looking at additional credit terms, that's outside of closing costs, so not including G1 and not including for broker compensation. So what could that be? That could be repairs maybe. It could be some other term that is not considered a, quote, closing cost or not called a compensation to a buyer broker. And then as we get down to 3G3, we're seeing the optional. Remember, it is optional. Why am I saying that? Because you don't have to request it. Your buyer does not have to say, I want you to cover my obligation to pay compensation to my agent. This is an optional thing still, and it always will be optional. But now you're including it in the offer, which means it can be rejected as part of the offer. So as far as the seller payment to compensate the broker, you would check the box and it says seller agrees to pay out of transaction proceeds X% of the final price and if applicable, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What's nice about this is that something has been removed. What has effectively been removed is the seller payment to buyer broker, the SPBB, that has been confusing everybody and making everyone's life mildly difficult. That has been removed and incorporated into the purchase agreement. And you got to keep in mind, when this was done originally, CAR was being forward thinking. So it was about 2 years ago, this was incorporated in because you did not have to have a buyer representation. If you had a buyer representation agreement and you were asking for it in the offer and checking 3G3 and all that, then you would use the seller payment of buyer broker to document that you have a buyer representation agreement as a buyer, and you would like that to be covered by the seller or included in. So instead of now having that, they've included language that's called an affirmative representation. So you're going to start seeing this a lot more. So I want to explain to you what an affirmative representation is. And the definition of that is a statement or action that tells someone else that something is true. I don't want to go as far as to say like an attestation and legally, but in the contract, that is what is happening. It is now the buyer who, instead of filling out an SPBB, is saying in the contract right here, buyer representation, buyer affirmatively represents that the buyer does have a representation agreement at the time that the offer is made. They have some form of a written agreement. So that is where now, sorry, this thing just got right in my way. That's something I hate about Zoom. That little window always jumps in. Okay. So we have our affirmative representation here. So as a buyer, so Javette's my buyer, she is signing this and she is saying, okay, I'm filling this out and I'm attesting that guess what? I have this. I have a representation agreement with Mike as my agent and I'm asking you to pay that. So this is paragraph 18 of the RPA. And I wanted to represent and show this here, that affirmative representation. It also shows up on letter D further down, page 12, where it says escrow holder shall provide the closing statement to the escrow company. And escrow holder shall provide it with their closing statement and is not intended to alter any pre-existing practice to the escrow holder. Now, this line for the escrow holder, there has been issues with escrow over the last few months, meaning, what instructions are followed. And so, or how is escrow going to do this? Remember, RPAs, the purchase agreement is a statewide form. We do things differently, regionally, possibly. Different companies have different practices. The bottom line is that if I have a buyer representation agreement and I give it to the escrow company is going to, one, follow those commission instructions or those payout instructions. And this does not, though, alter whatever their pre-existing practices are of how they disperse out funds or follow theirs. So this was more for the escrow company to be, or companies to be able to follow. So now, any questions, actually, before I go further, any questions about this part so far? Because I'm looking at the chat window too. So is there any questions about any of this right now? We're good? Okay. Because remember, those are the major changes in there. I have to do with just the broker compensation and the induction into the RPA for that. And of course, we have that separate compensation statements for buyer and seller and all that and everything that we're moving into. Now, as far as I move forward now, every single one of the forms that has a signature on it, like for an entity, the includes what? The RLA, the listing agreement, the RPA, which is our purchase agreement, the BRBC, the buyer representation and broker compensation, the lease listing agreement, okay, property management agreements, anything that has an entity signature. What's an entity? Okay, it says right here, anything like a trust, corporation, LLC, probate, power of attorney. We deal with a lot down here in San Diego with our military. Anything that has an entity buyer, non-individual, has been restructured to this. So all I did was I took the one out of the RPA and I went to show you one for the buyer, one if it's a seller or renter, whichever. And it's been cleaned up. It's been moved around to where the full entity name is at the top. So if it was me in a trust right here under 2, it would say the Michael Shankman Living Trust dated 12/21/24. Okay, that would be in here. Then the contractual identity of the buyer is down here. So whatever their name is in terms of the trust. So say Javette is on my trust and she's the successor trustee. So it would then have her name as successor trustee or just her name, and then imply that anywhere that you see her name, she is acting on behalf of my trust. And I'm hoping that makes sense. All they did was restructure this a little bit and make it easier to follow and easier to complete. So that's why I'm just showing it you here. Full name of entity, then the signer, whereas before it was the signer, then the full name of the entity. And that's been changed on everything. Now, couple new forms that we should go over that go back to the compensation changes. So estimated compensation costs for buyer and seller. These are actually two forms. There's one for the buyer, ECCB, and then one for seller. All I did was merge the title together because I'm showing you both. And they're almost identical. One for the seller, one for the buyer side. And what I did was I jumped in here so you guys can see. Here is purpose and use for the buyer to explain the amount of costs a buyer will incur after considering different methods to structure an offer for compensation. Down here for the seller, this form is a tool to explain the net proceeds a seller will receive after considering different methods for compensating a buyer's broker. So that's all it's doing. It's giving us that form that shows the client disclosing to them what their costs are going to be. Remember, we've had forms like this in the past. We had stuff where if you showed a property and it had different compensation, you were outlining what those differences are. Same thing here. It has different scenarios for each one. Scenario 1, scenario 2, 3. If the seller pays the buyer broker in full, if they pay in part, if the seller does not pay the buyer broker, and then down here for the seller, if you pay them, what is your proceeds going to be? And it does 3 scenarios and 2 prices. So it does a comparison. What I didn't show was the second part of this has another purchase price. So you can put that in and give it to your client. Now, are these required? No. Because a lot of these things are going to go for your brokers, or if you're a broker on this call, for how you want to dictate it to your agents. I recommend, though, you put something in here for your agents to use. Everything is about disclosure to our clients. That is how we service our clients, is to give them the information they need so they can't come back and say, hey, Denise didn't tell me that, or DeAnthony didn't tell me that one. I needed to know. And at minimum, it's here's your cost breakdown so you can make your decisions moving forward. Now, the other changes we saw, we had some changes to the counter offers. And I know because I do compliance for some offices and some reviews, one question I always get is the counter time frame expired. Do we have to do an amendment to it before we respond? Do we have to rewrite the entire offer? Do we have to send a new counter offer in? And that kept coming up. What I used to say is, well, look, if you guys agree to it, you're fine. You want to put some language in, et cetera, et cetera. This became so frequent, especially if it's a 3-day expiration on the counter response, and someone go 4, 5, 6 days, whichever, because they're dealing with multiple offers, et cetera, to where language was included to say, hey, let's do what's common sense. So if you look down here, and I want to show all 3 are the same. That's the SCO, which is the seller counteroffer, the BCO for the buyer counteroffer, and the SMCO, which is the seller multiple counteroffer, okay? Counteroffer is valid regardless of whether any previous offer or counteroffer expired by its terms. So what does this mean? The way I've explained it is receiving party is going to be the one who has the power, okay? Or we're going to work an agreement here. So say I receive a offer from Albert. I give Albert a counteroffer. It's a 3-day expiration. Albert responds to me 5 days later, okay? It says right here, late acceptance. If the date of the seller's signature is after the expiration specified in 2A, seller's acceptance is only binding if buyer agrees to the late acceptance by signing below on the 3rd day after the date. So what's going to happen is he's going to sign the counter, send it back to me, and then I'm going to accept that too. So that's how that works. There's no need for an addendum. There's no need for anything else. Now, what does that mean? I'll accept it. I'll send that forward. So Albert will take my counter or send it back to me, and then I will have the choice to say, yes, I'm going to go ahead and take it even though it's late. So I have the option to say it expired, is really what came into this. So it's basically you're giving mutual acceptance, only binding if buyer agrees to late acceptance by signing below, or in here, if seller agrees to late acceptance by signing below. So it comes back to acceptance 3 days after the signature of the late acceptance, if that makes sense. So say we go 5 days, Javette signs it, sends it back. I have 3 days to accept that late acceptance. That's how that works. No need to add an addendum to it. No need to do anything else. This is already incorporated into the counter offers. So I was really excited about that. It saves my time for all the questions I have to answer on that one, because that one comes up all the time. So does everybody understand that one? I think we've all been in that position once or twice. So especially if you're running brokerages. Buyer representation and broker compensation agreement, CAR form BRBC. So clearly we've had a lot of things that have come up on this one over the last few months. And there weren't many changes to it other than some things that kind of cleaned it up. So under property type, does anyone know when they would exclude their SFR? I've started asking this because I have yet to ever exclude an SFR from it, but still. Where it used to be was it says single family residential, and then you say including condominiums, and then had a line here that said SFR is excluded from this agreement if you chose to. All they did was move that. They put it up to here where it says, or if checked, SFR is excluded from the agreement under the SFR section. So that's all that was put in there. I'm going to skip further down here where it says under compensation. Remember, you can put as a refresher under E when you talk about that not fixed by law, fully negotiable compensation, right? That you can do it as a fixed rate, you can do it as a percentage, you can do it as whatever you choose to, or the attached compensation schedule. The words that were added were broker created. And the reason those were added is because people were calling CAR and asking where their compensation schedule was. And CAR does not have a compensation schedule, nor do they have any intent of creating one. That is something as a broker we have the right to create with our client. We could say this is how we choose to, what would that be? Like if you buy a property, let's say between 200,000 and 500,000, I'll charge X amount. If you do this, I might charge this percentage. If it goes 30 days, this is how much I'm going to charge you. If you don't buy a property within X amount of time, this is how much we're going to charge you. You can do that. You can create a compensation schedule. The point is, it's not created by the California Association of Realtors or any entity on zip forms here other than you. You have created that and your client has agreed to it. So that's why that language was specifically put in there. Now, under F, the cancellation rights, which we're going to spend probably most of the time going over, there were some complaints where, remember when we made changes or when the changes were made to the buyer, to the BRBC, it was now you've always had non-exclusive or exclusive representation. But the thing was, if you had exclusive representation, in both cases, it can't exceed 3 months without a renewal. Okay, so the maximum term is 3 months, and then you renew it as many times as you want from there. If it was non-exclusive and you cancel, the cancellation takes effect right away. If it was exclusive and they canceled it, it would take effect in 30 days, even if you had, like, say, 3 months. So say I sign an exclusive buyer representation agreement for 3 months, and 2 weeks in, Javette says, hey, I'm going to cancel. It gives me written notice of a 30-day cancellation. It would cancel in 30 days, regardless of what the agreed initial term was. There were brokerages that said they wanted to shorten that. So they brought it down. So it says here, exclusive, cancellation effective 30, or it can go less. You just can't exceed 30 days. So you can make it better. I can say cancellation would be effective in 24 hours or immediately. So that's why that line is now in there for cancellation. And you'll see the changes to the cancellation forms. As we move down, letter G, buyer financial and personal information. This was done for us as brokers. It really was. Buyer does not have sufficient funds to pay brokers. So remember, as agents, we have choice. We do. We can say we're not going to move forward with a client if they can't pay or if whatever it is. Some people might disagree with that, but that's we work, they work, we all do things mutually here. So with that being said, say I meet a client, the client does not have any funds to pay me, and I have to make sure it's included by the seller. For whatever reason, I could make that decision to say this doesn't work. Buyers, or say we're in escrow on the property, or they get an offer accepted and they just cannot pay me, I do not have to continue with that representation. So, and we'll see this in a separate form. So Javette is my client. She's my buyer. We made an offer on Denise's property. Okay. We've asked for compensation of, say, 2% as an example. Okay. Denise has come back and says, I will not pay any buyer compensation, period. We say, we'll reduce it to 1%. I will not pay any buyer compensation, period. Javette does not have the money to pay me. I can choose to walk away from that transaction. Javette will move forward as a non-represented buyer, and she will get a non-agency. And it will be specific. This line allows me to walk away. I am not obligated to be an agent where I will not get paid. And at the same time, the client does not have to abandon the property if they don't want to for that reason. So we'll get into this on the cancellation forms, because there's cancellation of agency, cancellation specific to one property, because that way you don't release the entire agency. But this is a newer thing. Remember, this was meant to protect you as well as them and say, look, this is what you want, but this is what we're going to have to do. So, and the services are very specific. I'm going to stop there. Any questions about that? We're good? Okay, good. That makes me happy. They're all paying attention. Or everybody's like, on Instagram right now. I don't know.
I have a question. What if you've already worked with them and you've helped them get the loan? You've already spent quite a bit of time and they just say, well, I don't have money now. It seems like there should be a consulting amount for that amount of time that you've spent with them.
Well, and I agree. And that's why, BC, you'll notice, and I'll back up. Where is this in the form? Okay, this is page 1 of the buyer representation agreement. So in a perfect world, or the way it should be, I wouldn't say perfect world, the way we're supposed to do it now is we've met, Maureen, right? And now we're sitting down and going over the terms of how our relationship is going to be moving forward. I should not be referring anyone to you or doing anything until I can, but I mean, if I'm just referring a lender to you, that's one thing. If we've been looking at property and doing all this stuff, we need to have this representation agreement completed. And that's now, as I'll get into, both by the settlement agreement and, of course, by law in the state of California, effective January 1. So I have to have some form of representation. And in this representation agreement, it says that whether or not, and we're taking financial information, do you have the money to pay me? And if the answer is no, Maureen, you have a decision if you want to move forward with that client, knowing that, because it's the same thing. Now it's disclosure to you. As an agent, you are now aware, hey, Mike doesn't have the money to pay me unless it gets covered by the transaction. And maybe now you can decide at that point, hey, this isn't going to work, or you've worked out some separate type of agreement for some cost, whatever it is. It's meant to have the discussion. And what we don't want is people locked in or saying, okay, well, I have to buy this, I have to do that. So that's really just about the conversation. But ideally, this is about the question and answer and the interview that you're each having in the very beginning. And that's what that part's about. Does that make sense?
No, I get it. It's actually, I do.
And yeah, to be blunt, it stinks. You might end up in a situation where, some of that work goes south, but at least you're aware of it. And maybe you guys have at some point made some sort of an agreement or an arrangement to understand what would happen there. It's meant to have the conversation.
I have a consulting agreement, but it really have to keep your time, because even if they check they have enough money and you can go back to the other one where they say they do, but you would spend a lot of time going through loans, especially in commercial. The broker's a lot more involved with the lender, and you go through a lot. I think people in residential too. So by the time you get to here, you've already spent a lot of time, it seems like. So I think that consulting agreement should start before you go, give them any help with the loan or the lender. I think that I see where they're starting, where you first don't show them a house, but a lot can go on before you ever show them a property. So
I completely agree. And that's why I like to fill these out right in the beginning. And with commercial, commercial's been doing this for quite some time now.
Yeah.
So on the residential side, though, clearly we have new changes that we're trying to really get into a standard of practice of saying, hey, we've met, here's our obligations, and now we're going to move forward fully understanding.
I think it's really good to have. I'm glad they have actually, because it makes the buyer, before they just go off with another agent and you spend all this time. So in a way, it's really nice. Say it's a consulting service.
No, I agree. So, but that's the thing. It's meant to have the conversation.
I think what would be really helpful is a time and billing. So when you go along, you can say, I spent this much time. We analyzed this. We looked at how you can finance different properties, and that's the hard part, because if you don't have QuickBooks or some way to keep your time, it's on Excel or it's on your calendar, it's not in a consistent place. So I would love somebody's referral for how they keep their time.
Well,
that client.
What I will say is this, and I see, Gloria, your hand up too. I want to answer this, because one thing, and I speak from a personal experience. I can't say how many times, or I lose track how many times I've had a client, even before all of this, where I would spend time going over things with them, finance numbers, whatever. Maybe I'd send them some properties, maybe even meet with them, do a consult on their listing. Didn't work out. And then that was done. And about a month later, I got a phone call saying, I'm referring someone to you because you were awesome. And I appreciate the work you put into it. So we never know. You know, there's always something. And I've had some who've just ghosted me like it's a bad date. That's just the way that goes too. So, but ultimately, I mean, I think what we're really trying to do and where a lot of these forums are really going with is, hey, we need to have disclosure of more information that's out there. And the information door swings both ways. It's also, as an agent, I am choosing to spend my time with you because my opportunity cost is up there, and we're going to at least understand where it's going. So, I mean, I see it both ways on this.
Yeah.
Gloria? Oh, I'm sorry. Maureen, is that okay?
No, that's great.
Oh,
I like that. You know, you just have to figure where you're going to start the risk, you know.
We take risks. Maybe I get a drink out of it from someone. Who knows? So, Gloria?
I was just going to ask, I don't know if this is the appropriate time, but are lenders including the buyer's commission, the buyer's agent commission in their documents, or they're lending or asking, you know, for the percentage of what we're expecting?
Yeah.
They are, but it's not included in the total credit cost informally right now. That is my understanding. So meaning if I have a 5% max closing cost credit, the compensation doesn't count towards that percentage. But that's not an official. That was done as a memo, is my understanding. They're looking at making that permanent.
I thought it was on the seller, the compensation. I thought that there's that checkbox. There's 14,033. I thought there's a checkbox.
It depends what, and that would be more, again, that's a lender specific. So I feel better having someone in because I've done some research on it, but at the same time, I don't know if they've made a change of that for 2025 and how they'll do it. Okay. But I will come back to that if it's okay. So I want to make sure we move on to a few of these things. Is that good?
Oh, yes. Thank you.
Good. Okay. I didn't want to cut anyone off. That's why. So, okay. So now we have modification of terms, buyer representation agreement. We have a specific modification that's been updated for either the BRBC or the PSRA. Remember the PSRA, the property showing representation agreement, which I'll show you. That's the mini version of the buyer representation. So, and you'll see as we have here, this can be used for multiple forms. It can be used for either the BRBC or the PSRA. It can also be used for the tenant representation and broker compensation agreement, the TRBC, which we do have a tenant representation and broker compensation. There were people who were using the BRBC for tenant representation. So we have a specific form for that, and this will modify any of them. So what if we need to make a modification? I know this has come up a couple times. It has come up where I've had people ask me, well, okay, I made an offer. So say I make an offer on Maureen's property. Sorry, it shifts as who's running my bar here. So Maureen's property, I make an offer on. And Maureen comes back as the agent saying her client does not want to pay more than 1%, and I've asked for 2%. So maybe I've had a conversation with Gloria and said, hey, I will agree to reduce my compensation for that. Now, before I had to do a modification of the representation, and if I was smart about it, I made it specific for that transaction. Why? Because if I reduced my compensation, if I simply said buyer representation fee reduced to 1%, I just reduced it for anything I show Gloria moving forward. And so I had to advise agents, be very careful when you do that, because I've seen that a few times. You want to be specific to the property. Well, now in the MT, it has a checkbox that says this modification to the compensation shall only apply to the following property, because it has cleaned that part up. Okay, and it shows the property type. Say your property type has shifted. Say now they're looking at multi-units, or they want to look only a certain type, or the location. So say you did it specific to maybe, like this case, San Diego County, and they decide to start looking in Orange County. We've adjusted. The location has changed as follows. The other question we keep getting is, what happens if we start with a non-exclusive and move to an exclusive? Well, now there's a box for that. So you would use your modification, MTBR, and you would check the box that says change from non-exclusive to exclusive representation. And broker agrees to change type of representation to this. Buyer's advised to read all paragraphs and discuss if they have any questions. So now you have the ability to make that correction. Before we had to do it on an ADM form or do a new BRBC. Now we can just simply modify it and use the time frame accordingly. Okay. Oops. Forgot I did that. Okay. Now, the property showing a representation agreement, CAR form PSRA, also has some modifications to it. Now, just to give a little background, if I'm not sure how many of you have used this, I've used it a few times. Here's a scenario. I am at an open house. Okay. And someone comes in, say Gloria comes in and says, you know, she signs in on my open house form, which I'll get into here in a second. Because remember, my representation, do I have to get a representation agreement if I'm hosting an open house? No. Why? Because I am doing that in service of the seller. Now, Gloria comes in and wants to see some other properties. Do I want to give her a buyer representation agreement? Well, it's a long form. It'll take us a little bit. I can actually do the PSRA, which is I call it the BRBC Lite. And it has some basic information in there and it covers our bases. It talks about compensation. It talks about the time frame, which in this case doesn't exceed 30 days. It's a non-exclusive only agreement, meaning you can't lock them into an exclusive with the PSRA. It would just be on the properties you show. And the former version only included for 3 properties. So what you're going to see here is intended for use on a limited number of properties, non-exclusive only. It also now has an agency form added into it because remember, we have to disclose agency. A lot of people don't realize agency is part of civil code. It was also part of AB 2992 that any type of, and that's the one that's now by law requiring written agreements when you show property. Anytime you do a showing on a property or you have to have a written agreement and you have to disclose agency. So agency has to be included in this. The PSRA did not used to have the agency disclosure form. Now it does. So if I go down here, I not only can now do just 3 properties, now I can attach a list of properties. What was happening is agents were doing like 2 or 3 of these and including all the properties on there. Now you can just simply type up a list of properties, check the box and say, okay, we're going to show these properties on here. And then people go, well, what if it exceeds that? Go do a BRBC, a non-exclusive or an exclusive BRBC. At that point, now we've gone on a date or 2. Now it's time to talk about where this relationship is going. And so that's how I like to think of it. We're moving forward into another stage of it with a bigger, better representation agreement. So now the PSRA can be used with more than 3 properties. Just remember, it's a maximum of 30 days. But now what's important is they've added in the continued right to payment of those, what's called, remember, broker involved properties. Remember, if I have a non-exclusive type of arrangement, it's the properties that I've shown you, right? It's the ones that I have what's called broker involvement. People like to say procuring cause. That's a legal term. We have to define what broker involvement is. And broker involvement means I've negotiated, I've, contacted someone, maybe starting to go over terms, done some form of a CMA or a virtual tour for you. It's not just I've emailed you a property. Now, what happens is, say I have this 30-day agreement, I've shown Javette a property, and 5 weeks later, she ends up going again with now Denise and buys it through Denise. But even though I'm the one who actually did have the broker involvement on that, the only way to guarantee that past the termination of the agreement is to have some form of a continuation period, something that says, like we have in the BRBC, any property I've shown you or had broker involvement, I have X number of days to where if you buy it after the termination of our agreement, I still get paid. I still get I get the representation on that. And that's what's here. So you can put in, if you leave it blank, there is no continuation period. It terminates when the agreement terminates. I know on my BRBCs, I usually do 6 months. I like to get paid for the work I do. That's just me. So I don't know. I gave up working for free a long time ago, even though it doesn't really seem like it. But with some of my clients. But that's why we have that in there. So I'm imploring you, please start using that. But that's why it was added in, because a lot of people are using the PSRA. It's becoming much, much more frequently. And it actually defines it here on C, the continuation of right to compensation for broker involved properties, just like in the BRBC. So now remember, say you have a listing agreement, and this is not what this is, but in a listing agreement, and I'm with, say, company A, and I have decided I'm going to leave my company, my brokerage, and I'm going to go to another brokerage. What happens to my listings? Well, I have to fill out forms to get my broker to approve transferring the listing. Well, now we have written requirements for contracts with the buyers. But is that contract with me? So Gloria meets me at an open house. We end up deciding we want to work together. She signs a BRBC with me. is she signing the BRBC with me or with my brokerage? It's with the brokerage. So if she chooses to leave, okay, I stay with the brokerage unless we transfer that representation agreement. See, so now we have that. So here's CAR form TOBR, which is the transfer of buyer representation, which says, very simply put, as we move in, may also be used for a transfer of a tenant representation agreement. And it says here that we have some form of representation agreement between the buyer, tenant, hereafter known as the principal. Principal is entered into contract, and then whatever is the consideration for release. I am not going to go through the next few forms in detail. I am going to recommend that you pull these forms up and read them so you understand them. And then my email will be at the end. Feel free to email me if you have any questions on it, because I'll go over a couple of key points. But please look at this. I am almost willing to guarantee that everyone in here is going to have a transfer of brokerage at some point in time, and they're going to want to bring their clients with them. So this will come into play. Okay. It's just the way our world is shifting now in real estate. The consideration. So say Javette is my broker and I have decided that I want to take Gloria with me as a client. And I'm asking, what do I need to do? What is our agreement? We're going to start seeing, and for those of you who are running your own brokerages, make sure to put in your handbook, your manuals, your brokerage manuals, what your terms are for taking buyer clients with you if your agents want to leave. We're going to have to start writing that into our handbooks, our policies. So consideration, if there's consideration for the release, yeah, you're going to pay me X amount when the deal closes, or whatever the new broker is going to pay. If maybe I go and work for Denise, Denise is going to pay Javette as a brokerage, whatever percentage as a referral for that, whatever it is, that's what's now in it. It also says that, you see, we can't just transfer it. We actually have to cancel and redisclose agency relationship. So first off, consideration, if applicable, and then termination of the previous agreement. You see, the way we need to do it is we're agreeing to let it transfer, but we're transferring it by canceling the existing and then re-signing a new agreement with a new agency disclosure for the new brokerage. Does that make sense? Because we have to redisclose agency. So you have to use AD prior to the change, give them the new forms, and then do a cancellation of it. So it gets a little confusing. That's why I want you guys to review this. And I know we're recording this, so we can go over it. Took me a little bit to understand it when I went over it with Carr. So here's the cancellation. So termination of the previous agreement, cancellation of confirmation of real estate agency for replacing a broker. Okay, this is an amendment to a purchase agreement. So say I'm in an agreement and I'm transferring that over. I'm in escrow. So that's where this part comes in. So go ahead and just review it. And then, because remember, we have to confirm above. I'm sorry, I skipped this. We have to cancel our previous agency. So that's where that comes in. Because remember, you confirm. So say Gloria comes to me as a client. I have told her now, I have disclosed my agency with the brokerage. Okay, these are the things I can do, I cannot do. This is how confidential information works. This is what advice is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now I'm leaving. I'm canceling that agreement with the broker here and going to my new broker and redisclosing that agency, and she is agreeing to it. That's how you have to think of it. Okay, I hope that makes sense to everybody. That's why the broker agrees to transfer, we cancel it, and then redo it with the new broker. Okay. So now we have also our COBR, which is the cancellation, straight out cancellation of buyer representation. Okay. So what is the effective date of the cancellation? We can do unilateral cancellation. That's when the buyer says, hey, I don't want to work with you anymore. I'm done. Just gives you the notice and it's X number of days. Remember, I have an exclusive representation with Denise. I've decided I don't want to work with Denise, and for whatever reason, and we have exclusive, which says by default, it's a 30-day. So I would check the box, check the one that says 30 days after receipt of the notice, or no, I would check B for exclusive representation and go from there. Maybe we adjusted, remember, our original BRBC and said that cancellation term can be 1 week. So then I would do B and check the box for 7 days per our agreement and send that over. So it can be unilateral or mutual. If I do mutual, it means we just decided we don't want to work together anymore. We're good. So I can actually say we had a 30-day notice period and she's just like, Mike, I can't stand you. Actually, Denise, I think you have said that to me before. I can't stand you and I don't want to work with you anymore. And we're going to check the box and we're just going to stay on the other side of the room, right? I'm kidding. I love Denise. I want to see if I can get her to respond. That's why. So now I can do a single property option. Remember I brought up before and I said we'd come back to this. So I have an agreement with Maureen, and Maureen's already told me she doesn't have money to pay for me outside if the seller doesn't want to do it. Then we have a situation now where the seller doesn't want to do it. Okay, Maureen really wants this property. I've worked something out with her. And I'm like, hey, I'm not going to work for free, you know, but we figured something out, whatever that is. That's all I'm going to say on that part. I have now agreed to terminate because I'm not going to work for free and I'm not going to have my representation be tied to this for no money or no compensation. So I can release it, and now Maureen's going to be self-represented, which means the seller, the listing agent, is going to give her a notice of non-agency disclosure and all that stuff. We're not going to worry about that. This cancellation, though, gets signed by Maureen. Me and my brokerage is now released from having agency. We are no longer there. We will not advise her. We will not do anything. If something changes, can we rescind this? Absolutely. But this is why we're doing that. And it says here, because the question was, well, what if Maureen doesn't buy that property? What if it falls out? Okay, well, we're still covered by a buyer representation agreement on anything else. So she now has to work with me still. But I've agreed to release her from this one so she can move forward on that property. Does that make sense? And that's why we do it. Okay. And that's going to be hard because we're going to have to say, I guess we're taking a hall pass. You know what I mean? So we're doing something. We're just not going to let it work here. So agency, and it says further on, non-agency. It says once cancellation becomes effective, it's very clear. Broker will not be the buyer's agent during any negotiation period. Whoops, I skipped ahead here. Sorry. Remember also compensation shall be paid. It talks about compensation, any expenses incurred, broker would receive a referral fee, if that's the case. And then down here where it talks about buyer and broker mutual cancellation or the unilateral. So say like Denise doesn't want to work with me, she would fill this out here as the buyer and send it over to me. And then all we have to do is initial it, acknowledging that we received it. Because that's just pretty much it. Now, when can we do a unilateral cancellation? We can do it under exclusive or non-exclusive. We can do it for either one. Whereas before the settlement and all this stuff, exclusive required that mutual consent. Now we have the 30-day period. So the buyer can say, hey, I'm canceling, send it over to you or your broker. Broker will initial they've received it, and that's it. 30 days passed, that's the end of it. We don't have to mutually agree to it. The mutual agreement comes in if we're trying to make some sort of an alteration on an exclusive. Does that make sense? We're all good? Before I move on to the next topic? Okay. I'm going to get into AB 2992. You may have heard of it. I've had so many questions come at me over the last few weeks specifically about AB 2992. I have had people say to me, I heard that a law was passed that meant we don't have to sign representation agreements before we show properties now. It changed the settlement, and I'm not going to do them anymore because of that. And I said, well, that's wrong, and you shouldn't do that. So I'm going to reiterate, please stop listening to Instagram or TikTok. TikTok's about to get banned anyway. Stop doing all that stuff. Here's the truth of what you need to do. I'm going to clear this up. What is AB 2992? Real estate law. What is a law? Something that has gone through the legislature and has been signed into law by the governor, which has been signed as of, I think it was a few weeks ago, about a month or so ago, if I remember correctly. Real estate law, buyer broker representation agreement, Title 4.1 buyer broker representation that says under 1670.50A, a buyer broker representation agreement shall be executed between a buyer's agent and a buyer as soon as practicable, but no later than the execution of the buyer's offer to purchase real property. That is effective January 1, 2025 in the state of California. Now, you know what's line's been screwing everybody up is the one right here that says as soon as practicable. So here's where the change comes in. Here's the NAR settlement, NAR Handbook on Multiple Listing Policy, section 5.0.2, which says unless inconsistent with state or federal law or regulation, all MLS participants working with a buyer must enter into a written agreement with buyer prior to touring the home. So we have the difference of a couple things. What's the difference between these? Well, notice I put the NAR symbol right there, NAR. Because if you are a member of NAR, you're what's called a realtor. By the way, what time is it? Javette? Denise? It's a great time to be a realist, right?
Great time to be a realtor.
There you go. But if you are a subscriber to NAR, you have the MLS, you have all these things, which is why I'm bringing that part up here. So the settlement applies to anyone who is a realtor. But then it was like, well, what about the people who aren't realtors? Remember, it's like all realtors are real estate agents, but not all real estate agents are realtors. So it was, well, what do we do here with this? So basically the law came in to say, hey, you have to have a written agreement, period. And that covers everybody. If you are a realtor, guess what? You need to have it as outlined here for any property through the MLS participant. If you're on the MLS, you're an MLS participant, you need to do it. But no matter what, you have to have a written agreement. And guess what? You should have a written agreement before you tour a property because you probably have MLS access and you're a participant at that point. So these are how I'm looking at it. If anybody tells you you do not have to do a written agreement or that it's only before the offer, I want you to remember that I've gone over this with you. You're playing with fire. MLSs will fine you, and they have been fining people. So, and it's also now, again, a matter of law. Also, 2992 made it to where you have to do that agency agreement before you do the touring, before you have those buyer representations. Because before it had to be done before an employment agreement on the listing side, before an offer was written. So that's where these things came in. That was effective August 17, 2024. This is now effective January 1 of 2025. What does it mean? It means you have to get a written agreement. So, and there was no change that eliminated that. And they're not done with us. The Department of Justice isn't stopping anytime in the near future. So we need to make sure we're following all these guidelines and rules. If anyone has any questions, please let me know. I suspect for those of you that are brokers, you're probably going to be dealing with this with some of your agents. Here's the clarification. If you want, we can forward this over to you, whatever you need. Okay. So last thing to go over here is our residential listing agreements, CAR Form RLA. The changes that were done in the RLA was to make it more in accordance with the asking of compensation, such as here under E2, which says if checked below, seller authorizes broker to market that they're willing to consider offers asking for concessions. Not that they will give concessions, not that they will agree to the concessions, but they are willing to consider the concession. Okay, and that no amount of the possible concession will be stated in marketing unless the seller notifies the broker in writing of the amount. So in the MLS listed above, if permitted by the MLS, and I say that because like here in San Diego, we have SDMLS versus CRMLS, and there's different things that can be on each one. So you have to check the rules of your MLS. Remember, this is a statewide form. Or in any other marketing outside of the MLS, which includes like Zillow, Redfin, and all these other companies that are out there. And remember, any private website, can I put concession or can I put compensation on my website? The answer is no, if it receives an MLS feed. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not as tech savvy to know what's receiving an MLS feed or not. That's just not my wheelhouse. So I just choose not to put it on anything. But check with your broker, or if you're a broker, look into what you guys can do. And then look under paragraph 10. Concessions on seller concessions were moved out in August over to the MLSA, which is the Multiple Listing Service Addendum. Now they've been moved back into the RLA from the MLSA. So now they're talking about specifically just what are seller concessions. What are seller concessions? Monetary payments that they agree to contribute towards a buyer's expenses. They may include, but are not limited to, cost of escrow, title, lender fees, repairs, inspections, or buyer broker compensation. So we're starting to outline what is a concession and then what specific concessions can be discussed. So, and that's why it says in here what these definitions are, and I recommend you guys read through them. Finally, our open house advisory, which is the non-agency disclosure and sign-in, now includes for a line that says can be used for open house or individual private showings. So I have a listing. Gloria contacts me, says she would like to see my listing. I can use this open house visitor non-agency disclosure as the form to show her that property. Because why? It's disclosing that I do not represent them as a visitor, but my service is in service of the seller. Now, if she decides she wants to work with me as an agent, I would then give her a representation agreement and disclose agency. So that's why that line was included in there. Now, people keep asking me, do I have to make someone sign into an open house? There's nothing in the settlement that says you have to make someone sign into an open house. There is, though, an obligation, in my opinion, this is my opinion, that you should know who the heck's been going in and out of your client's property. Why? Because what's home? Home is a safe space. Remember, we have an obligation, so we should be knowing who comes in and out of a property at minimum for insurance liability, and even below minimum of that, because we should be protecting someone's house when we're letting them in. So we should be letting people in. Aside from that, we should be disclosing non-agency, meaning just because you walk into the property, I need to tell you that anything I tell you or you tell me is in service of the seller. And that's why we have these forms now. We have to make sure we're disclosing that, because you can create an agency relationship without a written form just by giving you advice and telling you how to complete things. I have established agency. So last change I'll go over. I know I lied. I said there was only one more in this last one. Last one, Fair Housing and Discrimination Advisory, just so you know, in CAR Form FHDA, which talks about protected classes and discriminatory practice and fair housing. There was finally the change made, which talks about race and race traits and characteristics, any arbitrary characteristic or intersectionality. So basically things like hairstyle, clothing, dialect, all of that is now enumerated in the FHDA. It was covered. It's now completely covered. So now at least it's enumerated as something that's protected as a protected class and characteristic. So aside from that, if anyone wants the December form, there's a quick summary on CAR. Here's the link for it, and I can send that to you separately. I'll put it in the chat before we close out and everything. And that really, I have a copy of it right here. It's about 4 pages. It shows each one, and it actually outlines what the specific changes were. It's something that I think you should read through. And then make sure you're looking at the new laws too. We'll try and do something separate, I think, Javette, so where we can go over the laws that are kicking in for 2025. This was just on the form updates. So it is 12:59. I'm good. Look at that. Right on time, man. I can't do that to save my life or any other appointment, but I am good here. So thank you so much. If anyone has any questions, I'll stay on for a few minutes. Other than that, Happy New Year to everyone. Happy holidays. So I think we're good.
Do you have any questions for Mr. Mike before we say goodbye to everybody? First of all, Mike, that was absolutely, I have so many notes here. So many notes. And
I'm sorry?
I said I have so many notes.
It broke up. I couldn't hear. I just want to put this web link in here for you guys.
You're just awesome is what I said. Go.
Oh, thank you.
I said. And
well, this is how we roll, right?
Yes, Wabed. This is being recorded. Yes, it is. Wabed, can I get a copy of it? Yes, you can. You guys, every Saturday on our careb.org, we have a YouTube station, you guys. If you guys, by Saturday, you guys will be able to see this recording, okay? And you guys, I am so thrilled on behalf of CAREB and our president, Leah Cotton. You guys, we have a great you guys lineup for 2025. Just like today, you guys, we have you guys, every second and fourth Wednesday, you guys need to be here, okay? And you guys, bring your other agents from your brokerage to come in and see it as well, you guys. I mean, I invited my agents. I don't know where they are, Mike. They're all
not here.
They're all in trouble, by the way, okay? But you guys, please, you guys, come the second and fourth Wednesday of the month, you guys. We have a great lineup for you. So before we end, let me see if we have any questions in here. Let me see. Let me check.
Can you put, Mike, I came in late. Did you put your information in the chat again?
Yeah, I'll just give you my personal email address, my phone number, okay? And if you have, again, and if you or your agents or anything need any help, feel free to reach out to me. If I don't know the answer, I'll direct you where to go to and just forward some other information. Everything I've gone over, by the way, is available on CAR right now. Okay, it's on your zip forms. When you log in, it's got a big red link right at the top, says forward moving forms right here. Yeah. So, but also, like I said, I'm part of CAREB. I'm also, like I said, I'm on education here at Javette. So if there's anything you guys need, I will forward everything over to you. Okay.
So thank you guys all for being here. On behalf of CAREB, you guys, happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. Until we see you guys in 2025 in January, okay? Bye, everybody. Everybody, please be safe. Thank you, Mike.
Be safe.